My guest today is Deepak Dutt, a technology leader and entrepreneur on a mission to secure the future against AI-powered threats and to inspire founders to transform their ideas from zero to meaningful impact. Deepak's career began in the software space. Inspired by his father's passion for technology, in his late teens, he founded his first company in the e-learning space, which he successfully led to an acquisition, relocating to Ottawa at the age of 21. While in Ottawa, Deepak balanced graduate studies with roles at Newbridge Networks and Nortel, where he spent nearly a decade gaining expertise in product development, go-to-market strategy, and technological innovation. These experiences reinforced his drive to harness technology's transformative potential. Then in 2009, Deepak founded his second startup, a cloud-based cybersecurity company. Over the years, he's participated in leading accelerators worldwide, including Barclays Techstars, Creative Destruction Labs, and the Canadian Technology Accelerator. Today, as founder and CEO of Zighra, he is building an operating system designed to defend against AI-powered attacks, working with financial institutions and governments to deliver robust security solutions powered by explainable AI, behavioral biometrics, and contextual intelligence. A passionate advocate of the zero to impact philosophy, Deepak is committed to inspiring tech founders to embrace big challenges and develop innovations that drive meaningful change. Thank you so much for being with us on the show today, Deepak. It's a real honor to have you here.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm always interested in how people began their interest in technology and how that led to a career in cybersecurity. It sounds like things began quite young for you. Can you tell us a little bit about what that journey was like?
Oh, absolutely, right. My introduction to computers were a long time ago. My first computer was the BBC Micro. When I was probably in grade 5 or something.
Okay.
It was a long time ago, right? So I was kind of playing around with that early on. So got my interest into computers. Well, my dad was always in that space, so that kind of helped gaining access to the latest and greatest technologies, right? So early days. Playing around with technology at its nascent strategies, got introduced into the internet, and cybersecurity was kind of, got into me when I was working with Nortel in telecommunications, right? So suddenly we were sending packets across the world, going through switches. So, working on the technology stack all the way to the OS, from the physical layer into the application layer. And we were seeing, how do we secure the packets that we are sending, right? So that initially got me started with, encryption and security and such. But my into cybersecurity was when I was traveling quite a bit. My credit cards used to get declined all the time. And I said, why is that? And that was apparently because their fraud detection systems were always flagging me for fraud. Because they said, you're not supposed to be traveling like that.
Yeah.
And that was very annoying for me. And I said, why is that? And I kind of further dug into it and was trying to figure out all the different players involved in the entire payments ecosystem. I said, the real issue is that because nobody understands who the real user is behind a specific device or transaction. Because the internet, transactions happened, and where does trust come from? Right? And there was a huge issue around cybersecurity and understanding the identity paradigm around proving who the real person was. And that's what really got me into cybersecurity in a serious way and trying to answer that specific question. How do you figure out who's the right person behind a device or a transaction?
Very cool. Just going back to Nortel there for a second, that would have been probably the late 90s that you were working there, somewhere around then?
It was actually 2000 through the 2009, I think.
Okay, yeah. Wow. So post.com bubble, everything that happened after there.
Exactly.
Yeah, we've talked about Nortel quite a bit on the show, just for the listeners that may not have had the backstory. A lot of the IP from Nortel was, I don't know if I need to say allegedly, but stolen by Chinese threat actors and really kind of a tragedy of a business scenario in Canada, because Nortel was sort of primed to be one of the leading network technology providers in the world and had all their IP stolen, which led to the collapse of the company. And I think if it's even still around, it's a shell of what it once was. So,
well, absolutely. It's probably the flagship of Canada at one point, right?
Yeah.
And it was a whole bunch of reasons. But yeah, I mean, the issue with bugs around the main research campuses was also a big issue that we never knew about. And it comes back into looking at the invisible spectrum and really finding out what's there. So again, has implication on security, but more of a cyber physical kind of security, right? Not only from a cyber cybersecurity perspective that's highly digital in nature, but from a physical security standpoint, how these two worlds kind of merging together.
Yeah, and for listeners, again, some backstory there. When they actually sort of started to unwind this IP theft, they found at the physical campus of Nortel a whole bunch of like physical bugging technology and in spyware stuff, and it was quite an operation that stole the technology. So we'll pour one out for Nortel today and move on. We're both Canadians on the show today, so these are things that are near and dear to our heart. So
absolutely.
Your current company, Zighra, is, quote, privacy-enhanced behavioral biometrics powered by AI at the edge. Sounds like this probably refers a little bit to your credit card problem you were talking about earlier. Can you maybe translate that and tell us about the problem you're trying to solve?
Absolutely, right? So again, the birth of the question was, how do you find out the real user behind a specific device or a transaction in a very transparent manner, right? And Zighra was a kind of built to answer this question early on, saying, how do we bring together technologies like sensor intelligence? How do we bring in AI? How do we bring in behavioral modeling to create a unique model for every user in a very transparent manner? And the idea was that we could do it the way you sit, stand, walk, interact with your applications. And from a mobile perspective, how do we take a look at how you hold the device, the angle you hold it, the pressure you apply on the touchscreen? So reading from all the different sensors, we would create a unique model for every user and then use that for continuous authentication and threat detection, saying that once you have logged in, how do we still know you're still the right user that's using it? Or is it somebody that's stolen your username and password that's now logged in and starting to use it? Or somebody who's hijacked your session and starting to use your session as you, right? So it was built for that purpose. And since we were using a lot of sensors, what we found out was it's got a lot of sensitive information in it because you can tell if you're sitting, if you're standing, if you're walking, if you're going out, when you're going to work. So it's got a lot of sensitive information in there. And what we wanted to do early on was to say, how do we really lock this down so that people feel comfortable for us to use this kind of technology, right? And, we kind of build a stack from the ground up to do this kind of sensor extraction, creating the models, and even doing the inference entirely at the edge, right? In a very thermally efficient fashion. And then securing that at the device level so that and information doesn't have to ever leave the device and go into some kind of centralized server.
So all the user biometrics are wrapped up in some kind of fingerprint, but that's never leaves the device. And then the fingerprint has some kind of way of confirming with the server that it is authentic.
Yeah. So if you think about it, right? So we are taking raw sensor information, information coming from accelerometers and the gyroscopes and the touchscreen. So it's raw information coming in. From there, we extract out features that would say, this is the way you interact. And something that's very unique about those features, it's a whole bunch of mathematical representations. And from that, we create a model, right? So the model may have 72 features that are very unique to you as a user. And then we secure that at the device level because these days devices have hardware level security there. So you could actually secure it inside, hardware level so that nobody can get access to that. Now, once your models are created behind the scenes, and then every time you interact, we'll say, is that the right user? Oh yeah, we have a high level of confidence this is the user. And we say it's a yes or probably not.
Yeah. Interesting. And you must have some pretty big OS level integration to gather that information on the device and then pass it through to a transaction in the web browser, or is this like a separate API path up to the cloud?
I mean, there's different ways you could have the distribution, right? I mean, if you really think about it, it's being designed in a very lightweight fashion that it can actually go into the chip level, right? Or it could go into the operating system level, or it could be at the device level. But if you want to, think about distribution from an application perspective, then you bundle it as an SDK, right? It's a plugin that can be plugged into the application, and then it works in the context of the application, right? So you don't have to have it working at the context of the entire mobile device, but it could be inside the mobile application. And then when you're using the application, then it gets active.
Very cool. Sounds like some really interesting technology and probably something that's got a lot of uses in the world where so much finance and transactions take place on your phone.
Absolutely. I mean, you think about the phones, but then you think about all the IoT devices, everything that human-machine interaction needs to happen, right? That's where you want to integrate this. And, payments And financial transactions are just one use case, but you could use it for any kind of cybersecurity or access or continuous monitoring kind of use case.
Interesting. So normally we try and focus in on a subject on the show. Given that we're both Canadians and both have an interest in our national security, I figured we would have a bit of a Canadian episode and talk a little bit about the strategic importance of the Arctic and all the stuff we see happening up there. I know with the current American administration, it's been in the news a lot. It's something that us as Canadians, I know we've been thinking about for a while.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, why don't we talk about, how has the strategic importance of the Arctic evolved in recent years, and particularly with the melting ice opening new maritime routes? How is that changing the geopolitical position of countries in this world?
Absolutely. So, the Arctic has always been interesting from a geopolitical standpoint, right? And even during the Cold War, I think it was of high importance, and that's where you had these early warning radars that were put in there to kind of detect missiles potentially coming from Russia before it hits North America, and we get that kind of early warning, right? But after the Cold War, that threat kind of dissipated, and it went back to being the cold desert, as it's called, right?
Yeah.
I mean, people don't survive in that kind of environment, at least not in huge numbers, right?
Yeah.
Now, what's happened over the last while is because of all the climate changes, the ice now has started melting, right? I think for the first time, probably since we know it, it's probably going to have the first day where there's no ice in the Arctic, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they call that a blue ocean event. I've seen people are predicting it in the next couple of years. So
exactly, and what's really starting to happen then is now if that continues. And the routes now, the maritime routes now start opening up. So there's the Northern Passage and the Northwest Passage. Now that becomes a very interesting shipping route for trade between major economies, right? Becomes now very geopolitically interesting. And because no activity has been happening in a serious fashion there, there's vast untapped, sources of, oil, minerals, critical earth. Everything that's now becoming very important from that standpoint. So there's a rush to now gain advantage of that, right? And say, okay, now how do nations now start participating in there and taking advantage of the trade routes, getting advantage of all the minerals, and while keeping in mind it's ecologically or environmentally very sensitive part of the world, right? So now, because that's all opening up, then you're going to start seeing a lot of great power rivalries happen, right? Because the Arctic's always belonged, always said to be part of the Arctic states. Russia has a huge presence there. A whole bunch of Arctic countries, including Canada, has a huge, importance in that area. Now, for example, Canada claims the Northwest Passage as ours, but then how do you draw the line between, is it internal or is it international, right?
Yeah.
All these things now come into play. And as you said, the administration in the South is also getting very interested. They're saying, we're very interested in Greenland, because Greenland, you can't have that kind of a gateway. And when we had that first early warning systems there, but so all that now is coming into play, and the actors like Russia and China are also now getting very active in the space. I mean, China is not an Arctic state, but it calls itself a near Arctic state, right? And now they are also starting to invest into Arctic countries from an infrastructure perspective, from an investment standpoint, and also trying to build something called the Polar Silk Road as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's getting to be a very sensitive area from a military presence standpoint, from a territorial claim standpoint, and also from an international diplomacy standpoint.
And part of the challenge there, I think, for Canada is historically, we do have these claims where, like the Franklin expedition, we've got this history of being in the Arctic, but like you said, it's very expensive and hard to keep populations in the Arctic, and so there's not a lot of presence, which I think makes the claim to the Arctic harder to defend against these sort of incoming interests.
Exactly. I mean, I was hearing a news item where they said we have a couple of hundred rangers with rifles and skidoos protecting the. right? So I think that's, and partly based on what you just said, it's very hard to have that infrastructure,
Mhm.
right? And for till date, um, there was not much activity in the Arctic because of the harsh environmental conditions. But now that's changing. I think Canada is just came out with its Arctic policy, right? And that might see some interesting investments in infrastructure and surveillance now, helping out in that region.
Um, do you have a sense of what Canada's doing strategically to like build out its Arctic defense? I know we have a couple sort of Coast Guard level icebreakers, but I don't think we have like a Navy that can operate in that environment. What is the plan going forward?
I think there's a lot of conversation happening, a lot of policies being made. I think Canada now is announcing its Arctic ambassador to see how they can collaborate with the rest of the Arctic states. But I think it's also actually signed the icebreaker ice pact with the U.S. and Finland to build more icebreakers. So I think it's slowly starting to get its act in place, but I think we need to still put together an overall strategy, to deter against a lot of threats that are percolating into the Arctic, right? So as I mentioned, there's the entire geopolitics side of things. There's the traditional threat side of things. There's the emerging threat side of things. So I think it's slowly starting to put its feet forward from a science and technology perspective. Early days of experimentation when it comes to technological innovations in that space. So I think it's definitely going to be a coordinated effort and
Yep.
collaborating with the Arctic partners and the others, and including NATO. I think there's a lot of attention going into that space in collaborating with coming up with a coordinated effort.
Mm-hmm. I find it interesting. We've really seen the nature of warfare technology change with Ukraine and the use of drones and all these different technologies. Do you think there's like the promise of some kind of advanced technology helping to secure the Arctic versus these really traditional, expensive, long to build ships?
I think that's going to be the strategy, right? How do we bring in AI? How do we bring in autonomous vehicles, underwater vehicles, surface vehicles, unmanned surface vehicles, UAVs? Because what we've been hearing is, there's actors like China and Russia that's hanging out in our territorial waters of the Arctic. So how do we keep constant surveillance of that during the winter months? Right. And the challenge for Canada too is the personnel, right? If you really think about the harsh environment, it's very hard to put people there in these harsh conditions or these periods. So how do we leverage technology to have constant surveillance? I mean, because if you think about it, even satellite coverage in that area is minimal. Sometimes we lose that connectivity, right? So I think there's a lot of thought put into it, a lot of research, and a lot of prototyping happening when it comes to putting in LEO satellites, low Earth orbit satellites.
Yeah.
Improve the connectivity from a communication perspective, from a surveillance perspective, Arctic specific sensors and satellites getting built. I think we're going to see a lot more activity in that kind of space where we can have more unmanned and autonomous operations, if you may.
Yeah, and I think for readers who aren't aware, I think it's the 58th parallel, somewhere near like the top of British Columbia in Canada, near the top of the provinces. There's no geosynchronous satellite service beyond that. So there is these weird polar elliptical paths that the satellites can take. But yeah, it's very hard to get connectivity. I think that's changed quite a bit with the introduction of Starlink, but I still think coverage is harder up there.
Yeah, I mean, it's about putting more and more low Earth satellites, at least to cover the regions where proper coverage is not there, right? So I think experimentation's happening. There's a lot of activity happening. So I think we might, get coverage in the next while.
Yeah. And when we speak of harsh environments, I don't think people quite understand how cold it can get up there. My stepfather worked at a diamond mine in the Northwest Territories, which is quite far up there. And I remember once they got shut down and had to stay inside because it was minus 113 degrees. And I believe that's Celsius, like with the wind and the whole thing. But like human life cannot exist outside in those temperatures. It's way too cold.
Exactly. And it comes back to, how do you put infrastructure in that kind of area? How do you power the space? right? And keep it powered. I mean, you can't really put diesel powered systems and bases out there just because how do you keep, resupplying it?
Yeah.
So really need something that's small modular reactors that nuclear powered and
Yeah.
alternate sources and really leveraging whatever solar and wind energy that we can get when it's available. Right.
And how do you keep, like, if we're talking about autonomous vehicles, how do we keep battery powered vehicles running in those conditions? Like it's almost impossible.
Exactly. I think that's why I said the traditional technologies might not be easily transferable into the Arctic kind of scenarios, right? It has to be
Right.
purpose built for the Arctic environments. And I think that's where countries like Canada have to take the lead, right? I think we're slowly starting to dip our, toes into the water there and thinking both from an unmanned perspective and from a manned perspective. We still need the icebreakers and such, but
Yeah.
how do we really increase the number of unmanned vehicles that can help surveil these vast area?
Yeah, and I'm sure given the temperature fluctuations that there's a lot to be borrowed from the space industry. I know they deal with some pretty drastic temperature fluctuations as well. So it could be a very interesting branch of technology that's uniquely Canadian.
Absolutely. No, I think we are, most well positioned to address it, right?
Yeah.
I think with the right kind of investment and the right kind of support, I think that'll be a unique contribution we can make to our allies and partners.
Right. Yeah, and you talked about energy infrastructure in the north. I've always been a little bit fascinated by, I think they were helium salt pebble bed reactors or something, the smaller size nuclear reactors. Do you think that's a big component of how we establish a presence in the north?
I think the SMRs, small modular reactors, will have to play a huge role because think about it, right? We need to put together a base, both from an energy standpoint, but also from a accommodation standpoint, right? If you need to put a base, how do we quickly put a base that's resistant to all these kind of weather conditions that can withstand this kind of ice kind of environment, right? So, and then how do you power it? So I definitely think small modular reactors are the way to go, but at the same time, we need to have a multi-layered strategy, like exactly like in cybersecurity. How do you, if something goes down, how do you put multiple layers on top of that, right?
Right.
So to back it up with solar powered or wind powered mechanisms, and then back it up with battery powered mechanisms, and then we need to have the diesel all working kind of synchronously, right?
Yeah.
We're getting into this kind of environment where we need, we don't know when it's going down. So I think backups become very, very important.
In these small modular reactors, they're considered much safer than traditional nuclear reactors. I know, especially in an environment where you can have so much unpredictable weather and kind of physical events take place, they're quite safe compared to a regular reactor, right?
Exactly. And it's important because, as I mentioned before, right, environmental and climatic conditions is kind of very core, right? Because, I mean, and that's the challenge when you're kind of opening up the sea routes there, and if all that mining is going to happen and all that oil exploration is going to happen, there's going to be huge environmental implications, right? And having a clean tech strategy from a modular reactor perspective, I think that's very, very key, right? Because we don't want to be contributing towards the climate problems in the area, because all the problems are caused because of climate change. We don't want to be kind of adding on top of that. So clean sources of energy like helium powered and such could definitely help. I think there's a lot of research that's happening to see what's the best mechanism from a reactor perspective that can support the environmental requirements and the power requirements of the area.
And I'll just sort of back up to some stuff I was saying earlier. I think we've been talking about there not being much of a population in the north, but there has been indigenous communities living there since time immemorial. How does that knowledge and that presence play into this? Or is this a partnership that has a lot to gain from working with us? Or
absolutely, I think that's going to be a critical part of our Arctic strategy, right? Because they have innate knowledge and they've been living there for such a long time, right? So any strategy that we adopt has to be in partnership with the indigenous communities, because they have the knowledge. Their support is kind of very key to this, because I mean, there's even, because think about it, right? I mean, state and non-state actors are playing in that space, right? And we need our ears and eyes open as we go into this. I mean, from a technology perspective, these can all be taken out. We can go deaf, dumb, and blind if they take out our satellite communications, if they take out our the surveillance communications or surveillance infrastructure, right? So, but end of the day, I think without engaging the indigenous communities, we wouldn't have a successful Arctic strategy, right? So they kind of become part and parcel of this, of securing our northern borders.
Yeah, and I mean, the whole thing just is so tragic to me in so many ways, that the world is changing, and all of this is rolling up into this area where, you think you would be safe to be alone and live your life. But the world has got its own plans for what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it was like that for such a long time, right? And I mean, that part of the world was ignored. And now because it becomes very geopolitically sensitive, if other countries coming in investing into those spaces, people there will take those investments because they want to have that region prosper. So we don't put the infrastructure in place, we don't secure borders, we will have a lot of other actors coming and playing in that space, because, as I said, and the land claims, the waterway claims, these are still up in the air,
right?
Because it's not very well defined,
and a lot of interests are competing with each other because there is so much opportunity up there.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's going to be like the big rush, and as I mentioned, not only Arctic states, but others are calling themselves near Arctic states and close Arctic states, and you're going to have a lot of players coming in, and part of it is, is it international waters? Because when you look at China, they're coming and setting up research stations, and their traditional way of investing into these kind of locations. And when the local population gets that money, I mean, absolutely, that's an added advantage for them. So even if you look at places like Greenland, China has been trying to invest there in a big manner, right? And when it comes down to the last minute, the Americans, because it's a geopolitical or geostrategical area, they have to come in and circumvent and then put their investments so that you can kick out the Chinese investment from there, right? Well, it's a lot of soft power, hard power plays happening, right? And this is where having the local community on your side is so key, for defense of those areas.
And I'm sure those economic investments can really help. I remember reading somewhere like how expensive food is in the north, especially fresh food, vegetables. It's like $27 for a head of lettuce. Like, it was mind blowing. I think the Canadian government provides some subsidies for food for people in the north just because it's so expensive to get nutritional food.
Like, how do you transport, right? And that becomes a huge issue. And I was even hearing that they have these huge balloons that are, multiple soccer fields big.
Yeah,
actually going and transporting items into this area.
Yeah, Zeppelins. I've long thought that's such an interesting way to move containers up to the north, because I think, again, with climate change, traditionally in the winter they use ice roads, which are literally like ice. They drive on the ice when it's frozen, but because of climate change, those roads are becoming less stable, and so it's like, what is the alternative to bring food up there?
Exactly. And I think, the icebreakers are part of the story, but I think, as we touched upon earlier, right, how do you now get the Navy? But if commercial transportation is going to increase in that area, right, how does infrastructure kind of play into that? And is there a way of doing this during the summers so that during the winters you have enough surveillance in that space, to have enough infrastructure in that place that can sustain 6, 7, 8 months of intense, harsh environments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see fields of small nuclear reactors running LED farms.
I mean, any innovation is, I think this is our time to innovate, right? We have very unique problems in a very unique area of the world, right? Mm-hmm. So, but this needs to have proper support, not only from from procurement perspective, but also from an investment perspective, and also from a industry perspective, right? How do we kind of bring all these things together? How do we get the defense world working with the industry, with the latest and greatest in technologies in solving these problems? Because, how do you get autonomous machines working with a mesh network in place that are self-healing, that can supply themselves to provide that kind of continuous monitoring and keeping the infrastructure up and running?
In the most harsh environment on the planet.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you got to go there to appreciate it.
Yeah. I've never been that far. I went to northern Alberta when I was younger and worked in a bush camp, and that was enough. If it gets worse, they can have it.
But think about it, right? As climate change happens, it becomes more and more open.
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah.
So it's going to see more traffic, right? And that kind of destabilizes the environment there a bit. But having the right infrastructure there in place will make that a bit more, accessible, but a bit more, conducive for everyone.
Yeah, change is coming. We better be ready.
Exactly.
Awesome, Deepak. This was a really fun, if not purely Canadian show. I hope the listeners got some interest out of it. Definitely something I've thought a lot about, and I know you have some deep knowledge here, so I appreciate you coming to share that with us.
Oh, thank you. No, I think I found it fascinating, and most commercial companies and most Canadians don't think about it, but now they're thinking about it because geopolitics is changing. As you said, push from the south is happening, saying you need to invest into your own defense, right? And it's becoming part of the NATO contribution as well. And I think that's where our politicians and our policymakers need to kind of think through is, okay, we need to spend that on our NATO commitments. Why don't we invest it into what's absolutely important for us, right?
So, and show we're good partners too, right? That's part of it. It's not strictly our defense. It's showing that we're good partners in this future that we're all building together, right?
Absolutely. And staking our name in this world, right? Canada is important. So how do we show that we are a serious player that has still got its geopolitical chops in place, right? And this shows that we can definitely be a player.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks so much for being on the show, Deepak.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Chris.
Yeah, bye.